The funny thing about snow is that it never forgets where people dump it. The morning the entire Ridgewood Heights HOA woke up trapped behind a 12-foot wall of packed ice and snow. 50 SUVs lined up like a parking lot that forgot how to move. I was sitting in the cab of my old Caterpillar plow, watching the sunrise turn that wall bright orange. Engines were revving. People were stepping out into the cold. Someone down the street was already arguing on a phone. And the only thing I could think was that the whole situation had started 3 months earlier with the quiet rumble of a snowplow at 5 in the morning. My name is Ethan Carter, and I've been moving snow for most of my life. My dad did it before me, and his dad before him. The Carter family winter business in northern Vermont for almost 40 years. When snow falls here, people panic. When snow falls here, my phone rings. Driveways, shopping centers, county lots, you name it. A couple years back, I bought a small 2-acre strip of land just outside the Ridgewood Heights subdivision. Nothing fancy, just enough space for my equipment garage and a place to park the plow trucks between storms. Quiet property, gravel drive, a view of the trees. Exactly what I wanted. The first storm that winter rolled in around late November. The kind of storm that starts with a soft hiss of snow against the windshield and ends with half the county buried under a foot of powder. I was halfway through my morning coffee when I heard the diesel engine outside. Deep rumble, beeping backup alarm. Then the sound of a truck bed lifting. I stepped onto the porch just in time to see the Ridgewood Heights HOA plow truck dumping a full load of snow right onto the edge of my property. A mountain of it. White powder sliding down into my lot like someone had emptied a giant freezer. I figured it was a mistake. Happens all the time with new drivers. I walked over, waved, told the guy he might want to check his map. He shrugged through the window and said he was just following HOA instructions. Then he drove off. I didn't think much about it until the next storm hit a week later. Same truck, same backup alarm, same pile of snow landing in the exact same place. That's when I met Linda Whitmore, president of the Ridgewood Heights HOA. Mid-50s, designer winter coat, the kind of confident smile that tells you someone has never heard the word no in their life. She looked out across my property at the growing snow pile and said something I still remember word for word. Your lot is commercial adjacent, she told me. You can handle it. I told her politely that it was still my land. She told me politely that the HOA trucks needed somewhere convenient to dump snow. That conversation lasted maybe 30 seconds. And over the next several weeks, every storm that rolled through Vermont brought another truck. Another load. Another pile. By January, the snow mountain sitting on my land was taller than my garage roof. By February, it was blocking half my driveway. The funny part is, nobody in Ridgewood Heights seemed worried about it at all. Because to them, it was just snow. To me, it was something else entirely. By the time January settled in, that pile of snow on my property had stopped looking like an accident and started looking like a plan. Every storm followed the same routine. Around 4 or 5 in the morning, the Ridgewood Heights plow trucks would rumble down the street with their amber lights flashing through the dark. The scraping sound of steel blades against frozen pavement echoed across the neighborhood, and 10 minutes later another truck would back into the edge of my land. Beep, beep, beep. Then the hydraulic lift would whine, and another avalanche of snow would slide down into the growing mound. At first I tried to treat it like a neighborly misunderstanding. I called the number listed on the Ridgewood Heights HOA website and left a message explaining that their trucks were using my property as a snow dump. Nobody called back. A week later, I sent an email with photos showing how high the pile had grown. Still nothing. The next storm brought 2 trucks instead of 1. I remember standing there in my boots one morning watching them unload while the cold air stung my nose and the exhaust from their diesel engines hung in the air like fog. The driver rolled down his window and shrugged like there was nothing he could do. HOA instructions, he said again. By the middle of January, the pile had grown into something you could see from the road. 12 feet high in some spots, packed down by weight and freezing temperatures until it looked less like snow and more like a small glacier parked on my land. My garage sat behind it like a barn buried halfway through winter. Some mornings I had to fire up my own loader just to clear enough space to get the plow trucks out for work. What bothered me most was how casual the whole thing seemed to everyone inside Ridgewood Heights. Their neighborhood sat on a gentle slope above my lot. Neat rows of houses with identical driveways and perfectly trimmed mailboxes. Every time the snowplows cleared their streets, the excess had to go somewhere. Apparently, that somewhere was my land. One afternoon, I walked up to the entrance sign, where Linda Whitmore was standing with two other homeowners watching a contractor salt the road. She greeted me with the same calm smile she had worn the first day we met, the kind of smile that suggests the conversation has already been decided before it begins. I explained again that the snow pile was blocking my driveway and making it harder to operate my equipment. She nodded politely, glanced toward the white hill on my property, and said something that stuck with me. "It is only snow, Mr. Carter. It will melt eventually." That was the moment I realized the situation was not going to change on its own. February storms started rolling in harder and faster, the kind of heavy wet snow that piles up by the foot overnight. Every storm meant more trucks, more dumping, more weight pressing down on that frozen mound. By the end of the month, the snow pile stretched almost the entire length of my property line, a long ridge of packed ice and powder sitting right where the HOA trucks had been leaving it all winter. And the longer I looked at it, the more I started noticing something interesting about where that ridge sat in relation to the Ridgewood Heights entrance road. The longer I studied that ridge of snow along my property line, the more the whole situation started to look less like a problem and more like raw material. Anyone who works winters in Vermont learns one thing very quickly about snow. Fresh snow is soft. But leave it sitting long enough through freezing nights and warmer afternoons. Let trucks dump load after load on top of it, and it stops being powder. It turns into something dense, heavy, almost like concrete if you know how to pack it right. One afternoon in early March, I climbed onto the top of the pile with a shovel just to get a better look. The surface had frozen into a thick crust that cracked under my boots with a sharp snapping sound. From up there, I could see straight down the slope toward the Ridgewood Heights entrance road. The subdivision only had one main exit that connected to the county road, a clean 2-lane stretch of pavement that curved right past the edge of my property before heading out toward town. And that was when I noticed something that made me stop and think. The ridge of snow the HOA trucks had been building all winter sat almost perfectly parallel to that entrance road, close enough that if it shifted even a little bit, it could start pushing outward toward the pavement. I stood there for a long minute with the wind cutting across the top of that frozen mound and realized something else. The snow was not mine. Technically speaking, every shovel and truckload sitting there had come from the streets inside Ridgewood Heights. Their plows had moved it. Their trucks had dumped it. My land had simply become the storage spot. That idea stayed in my head the rest of the afternoon while I worked on clearing a grocery store parking lot across town. The sound of the plow blades scraping asphalt echoed in my ears while I thought about county property rules and snow removal contracts. Years of doing winter work teaches you the small details most people never notice. Snow that falls naturally on your land is one thing, but snow that gets hauled somewhere by a truck, that is different. That is considered deposited material. And deposited material usually comes with responsibility attached to whoever put it there. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and started digging through the County Public Works website. Snow dumping regulations, municipal hauling guidelines, liability rules for winter road maintenance. Most of it was written in dry government language that could put you to sleep if you read it too fast. But after about 20 minutes, I found the line that made everything click into place. According to the county code, any organization transporting snow from maintained streets was responsible for the safe placement and containment of that snow after it was dumped, which meant the pile sitting on my property was not just a pile of snow. Legally speaking, it was Ridgewood Heights material. And if Ridgewood Heights material ever caused a public access issue near the county road, the responsibility would go straight back to the people who put it there. I closed the laptop slowly and looked out the window toward that massive frozen ridge sitting in the moonlight beside my land. The cold air outside had hardened the surface again overnight, locking all that snow into place. And for the first time all winter, I stopped seeing it as something I needed to get rid of. Instead, I started seeing it as something I could shape. I did not start moving the snow right away. Anyone who runs heavy equipment learns that rushing a job usually makes it worse. Instead, I spent the next few days watching the pile the way a carpenter studies a stack of lumber before cutting the first board. The ridge stretched nearly 200 feet along my property line now, a white wall that looked almost natural from the road. Every morning the sun would rise behind the houses of Ridgewood Heights and cast long shadows across it. Every night the temperature dropped back below freezing, tightening the surface until the entire mound hardened into a solid mass. Perfect conditions for shaping. I began small. One quiet afternoon after finishing a grocery store parking lot across town, I pulled my Caterpillar loader onto my property and idled beside the ridge. The engine hummed low and steady while I studied the angle of the pile. The trick with snow is compression. Push it slowly, pack it down layer by layer, and the air squeezes out until the surface becomes dense and stable. The same principle highway crews use when they build temporary winter barriers. I lowered the bucket and nudged the base of the ridge inward just a few feet, tightening the snow into a thicker bank. The metal edge of the bucket scraped across the frozen crust with a dull grinding sound. Nothing dramatic, just shaping. Over the next several days I repeated the same quiet routine whenever I had spare time between contracts. Push, pack, smooth, then step back and let the cold lock everything into place overnight. From the road it probably looked like normal snow management. Anyone passing by would just see a contractor organizing the mess sitting on his land. Meanwhile, the trucks from Ridgewood Heights kept arriving after every storm, beeping backup alarms before sunrise. Another load sliding down the growing ridge. They never seemed to question why the pile looked a little straighter each week, a little more defined along the edge closest to their entrance road. By the second week of March, the ridge had started to resemble something different. Instead of a random mound, it had become a long packed wall of snow running almost the entire length of the boundary between my property and the subdivision road. 12 feet tall in some places. Solid enough that even my loader bucket bounced slightly when it pressed against the surface. I remember one morning standing beside it with a cup of coffee while traffic from Ridgewood Heights trickled out toward the county road. Parents heading to work. Kids riding the school bus. Nobody paid any attention to the white wall sitting a few yards away. To them it was just another part of winter. What they did not realize was that every truckload they dumped added weight to that structure. Every storm made it stronger. And the forecast for the following weekend called for the largest snowfall of the season. 12 to 14 inches according to the Weather Service. When I heard that report on the radio inside my truck, I could not help smiling a little. Because once that storm arrived, the final shape of the wall would not take much work at all. The storm arrived late Friday night, the way big Vermont storms usually do, quietly at first. Around 9 in the evening, the wind started pushing light flakes across the road, thin white streaks drifting through the glow of the streetlights in Ridgewood Heights. By midnight, the snow was falling thick enough that the entire neighborhood looked like it had been wrapped in a blanket. I was sitting in my garage listening to the weather radio while the loader idled outside warming up. 12 to 14 inches, just like the forecast promised. Perfect packing snow. Around 3 in the morning, the first plow trucks rolled out from the subdivision. I could hear them before I saw them, the deep rumble of diesel engines and the sharp scraping sound of metal blades clearing pavement. Their amber lights flashed through the snowfall as they pushed long waves of snow down the street toward the entrance road. Then came the backup alarms. Beep, beep, beep. The first truck backed up to the edge of my property and lifted its bed, sending a heavy cascade of fresh snow sliding onto the ridge I had spent weeks shaping. Another truck followed 10 minutes later. Then another. Each load landed exactly where the others had all winter, piling onto the frozen wall until the ridge grew thicker and taller under the weight. I stayed inside the garage doorway for a while just watching the process, letting the storm do most of the work for me. Snow kept falling. Soft at first, and then heavier, covering everything in a fresh layer of powder. By sunrise, the storm had buried the entire county under more than a foot of new snow. The trucks from Ridgewood Heights had added at least 6 more loads onto the ridge during the night. When the storm finally slowed around 8 in the morning, the wall along my property line looked enormous. Taller than the cab of my loader in several places, packed tight by weeks of compression and now capped with a thick layer of fresh snow. I climbed into the Caterpillar and eased it forward across the frozen ground. The engine growled low while the bucket pushed against the base of the ridge. The snow barely moved at first. That is how you know it is solid. I adjusted the angle of the bucket and began guiding the mass outward inch by inch, shaping the outer face until the wall leaned gently toward the subdivision entrance road. Nothing unstable. Nothing dangerous. Just a packed winter barrier sitting exactly where the snow had already been dumped. The work took less than an hour. Push, pack, smooth. By the time I shut the loader down, The ridge had become a continuous wall of snow running beside the entrance road like a frozen levee. Anyone leaving Ridgewood Heights could still see the county road ahead, but the packed snow bank now stood only a few feet from the edge of the pavement. Close enough that another round of dumping or shifting snow would leave very little space at all. I stepped out of the cab and looked across the white landscape while the last flakes drifted down from the gray sky. The neighborhood behind me was quiet, houses still buried under fresh snow, smoke rising from chimneys in the cold morning air. And I knew exactly what was going to happen the next time those plow trucks came back with another load. The next morning the sky cleared the way it always does after a heavy Vermont storm, pale blue stretching over a landscape that looked almost untouched if you ignored the plowed roads and the mountains of snow along every driveway. Cold air moved across the fields in slow, quiet waves, the kind that makes every sound travel farther than usual. I was standing beside my loader finishing a cup of coffee when the first car from Ridgewood Heights rolled toward the entrance road. It slowed near the curve where the packed wall of snow ran along my property line. The driver leaned forward over the steering wheel the way people do when they are trying to understand something unexpected. The road was still open at that point, but the lane felt narrower now with the snow bank sitting so close to the pavement. A few minutes later the school bus came through, its tires crunching across the salted road. The driver eased around the curve carefully, glancing at the tall white wall that had not been there a few weeks earlier. After that, the neighborhood traffic began to build the way it does every weekday morning. Pickup trucks, sedans, a couple of sport utility vehicles, all inching toward the county road through the single entrance. Nobody said anything to me that day. Most people simply assumed the snow bank was part of the normal winter mess that builds up along roadsides by March. What they did not realize was that the ridge had reached a point where even a small shift in snow could push it outward. And snow shifts more easily than people expect when fresh loads get added on top. That afternoon, the temperature rose just above freezing for a few hours, softening the outer layer of the wall before dropping again as evening arrived. When the cold returned, everything hardened once more into a dense frozen structure sitting right beside the pavement. Late that night, I heard the plow trucks again. Another smaller storm had rolled through the county, dropping just a few inches across the roads inside Ridgewood Heights. The sound of diesel engines echoed down the street, followed by the familiar backup alarms. Beep, beep, beep. I stepped outside onto the porch and watched through the cold air as the first truck lifted its bed. A new load of snow slid down onto the ridge. The fresh weight pressed against the wall I had shaped earlier that day. The snow settled slowly with a deep muffled thump. Another truck arrived 10 minutes later. Then another. Each load stacked higher against the packed barrier that had been growing all winter. The trucks finished their route and drove away without paying much attention to where the new snow had landed. From their perspective, the job was done. Streets cleared. Snow removed. Business as usual. But as the night temperature dropped again, that new snow began to freeze into the layers beneath it. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the wall along my property line had expanded outward just enough that the edge of the packed snow bank touched the shoulder of the entrance road. Not blocking it completely yet, but close enough that every vehicle leaving Ridgewood Heights had to slow down and squeeze through the narrowing space beside it. By the third morning, the change was impossible to ignore. Cars from Ridgewood Heights rolled slowly toward the entrance road, and then stopped one by one as drivers realized how narrow the gap beside the snow wall had become. Tires crunched over packed ice, while people leaned forward in their seats, trying to judge the distance between their mirrors and the frozen barrier sitting along my property line. A pickup truck eased through first, moving at the speed of someone backing into a tight garage. Then a small sedan followed, its tires brushing loose snow along the edge of the pavement. The space was still technically open, but the road no longer felt like a normal neighborhood exit. It felt like a corridor carved between a wall of snow and the opposite curb. I stood beside my loader across the lot pretending to check the hydraulic lines while I watched the slow parade of vehicles inching past. It did not take long before someone inside the subdivision called Linda Whitmore. Around mid-morning, her white sport utility vehicle appeared near the entrance sign and rolled cautiously toward the curve in the road. She stopped halfway through the narrow section and stepped out into the cold air, staring up at the snow wall stretching along the edge of my property. The bank was taller than she was now, packed solid from weeks of freezing and the extra loads her plow trucks had dumped the night before. She walked a few steps closer and pressed a gloved hand against the frozen surface like she was testing whether it would move. It did not move at all. A few minutes later, she spotted me standing near the loader. The expression on her face had changed from curiosity to frustration by the time she reached the fence line between our properties. She asked what had happened to the road. I told her the same thing I had told her all winter. The snow on my land had come from Ridgewood Heights trucks. Every load they dumped had added weight to the ridge sitting beside the entrance road. Now that ridge had grown large enough to press outward toward the pavement. She insisted that I needed to remove it. I reminded her calmly that the material sitting there had been placed by her contractors. According to county guidelines, whoever transported the snow was responsible for managing where it ended up. That conversation lasted longer than our first one months earlier. Drivers from the subdivision were beginning to line up behind her vehicle, waiting for space to squeeze through the narrow passage. Engines idled. Exhaust drifted into the cold air. Eventually, she returned to her vehicle and carefully guided it through the gap toward the county road. The line of traffic behind her followed one car at a time. That afternoon, I heard several more plow trucks working inside the neighborhood again, clearing smaller side streets that still had snow left from the storm. And just after sunset, the familiar sound echoed across the lot once more. Diesel engines approaching. Backup alarms ringing through the cold air. Another truck bed lifting beside my property. Another load sliding onto the ridge that had already begun pressing against the road. The next morning, the road did not look like a neighborhood entrance anymore. It looked like the exit of a tunnel carved through snow. Overnight, temperatures had dropped close to 10 degrees Fahrenheit, turning every loose layer of snow into a frozen shell. The new loads the Ridgewood Heights trucks had dumped the evening before had settled against the packed ridge and hardened into the structure beneath it. By sunrise, the snow wall along my property line had pushed outward another foot. Now the edge of the barrier sat directly against the shoulder of the entrance road, leaving only a narrow strip of pavement open for vehicles to pass through. I was standing beside the loader warming my hands on a cup of coffee when the first wave of morning traffic reached the curve. A silver sedan rolled forward slowly, its tires crunching against the icy surface. The driver leaned out slightly, checking the mirror against the frozen wall that towered beside the road like a white cliff. The car squeezed through, leaving barely enough room for the next vehicle behind it. Within 20 minutes, a small line of cars had formed inside the subdivision. Engines idled. Brake lights glowed red against the snow. Parents trying to get to work, kids waiting for the school bus, delivery vans inching forward one at a time through the narrow opening. The entire flow of traffic from Ridgewood Heights had slowed to the pace of a parking lot. I could hear frustrated voices drifting across the cold air whenever someone stepped out of their vehicle to look at the wall more closely. It did not take long before Linda Whitmore arrived again. Her white sport utility vehicle rolled carefully down the street until she reached the bottleneck at the entrance. This time she did not even try to squeeze through right away. She stepped out and stared up at the packed ridge running along my property like it had appeared overnight. The wall was well over 12 feet tall in some places now, layered with weeks of frozen snow and the extra loads her trucks had added the night before. It looked permanent, like something carved into the landscape rather than something that could be pushed aside with a shovel. She spotted me across the lot and walked over again, boots crunching through the snow while the line of cars behind her continued to grow. Her voice carried clearly through the cold air when she asked if I was planning to clear the road. I told her the same thing I had explained the day before. The snow sitting there had been transported from Ridgewood Heights streets by Ridgewood Heights trucks. According to county regulations, whoever hauled the snow was responsible for managing the pile safely after it was dumped. She looked back toward the long row of vehicles waiting behind her and then up at the frozen wall again. A few more drivers stepped out of their cars, trying to understand why the road had suddenly become so narrow. The morning sun climbed higher above the rooftops, casting long shadows across the snow bank and the crowded entrance road. And as the temperature continued dropping through the late morning cold, the packed layers of snow hardened even more, locking the entire wall into place beside the only exit from Ridgewood Heights. By late afternoon, the entire entrance to Ridgewood Heights had turned into a slow-moving line of vehicles. What used to be a quick right turn onto the county road had become a careful maneuver through a frozen corridor barely wide enough for a single car at a time. Drivers rolled their windows down to look at the packed wall beside the pavement, shaking their heads as they inched forward. The snowbank stood there like a solid white cliff, more than 12 feet tall in places, the surface hard and smooth from weeks of freezing and compression. I could see the moment when people realized the wall was not just a temporary pile that would disappear with a shovel. It had become a structure. Linda Whitmore spent most of that afternoon pacing along the edge of the road, speaking on her phone while glancing back at the line of cars waiting to exit the neighborhood. A few homeowners gathered near the entrance sign, pointing toward the wall and then toward the trucks that had been hauling snow out of the subdivision all winter. Eventually, a county public works pickup arrived, its orange light spinning slowly as it pulled onto the shoulder of the road. The inspector stepped out and walked the length of the snow wall, studying the layers of packed snow stacked along my property line. He asked a few simple questions. Who had been transporting the snow? Where the trucks had been dumping it? Whether the material had been moved from maintained neighborhood streets. I answered honestly. The snow had come from Ridgewood Heights. Their plow trucks had hauled it here after every storm. For months the loads had been stacked along the boundary of my property. The inspector nodded while he wrote notes on a small clipboard, then looked back toward the line of vehicles waiting to squeeze through the narrow gap beside the wall. According to county guidelines, any organization transporting snow from roadways had to ensure that the dumping location did not interfere with public access. In this case, the ridge sitting beside the entrance road had clearly grown large enough to create a traffic restriction. That responsibility belonged to whoever had placed the snow there in the first place. Linda Whitmore stood quietly beside the road while the inspector finished writing his report. The afternoon sun had begun dropping toward the tree line, casting long blue shadows across the frozen wall and the crowded entrance road. Within an hour, a contractor hired by the Ridgewood Heights Association arrived with a large loader and began carefully carving sections out of the packed ridge to reopen the shoulder of the road. It took them the rest of the evening to remove enough snow to restore a full lane of traffic. I watched the process from across my lot while the engines hummed and chunks of frozen snow broke loose from the wall that had grown there all winter. The funny thing about snow is that it does exactly what gravity and pressure tell it to do. Stack it long enough in one place, and eventually it becomes something solid. And sometimes the only people surprised by where it ends up are the ones who put it there in the first place.